Hello, my name's Steve Seven. Welcome to another installment of Spiritual Alchemy. These videos that I'm doing on YouTube are designed to be an auxiliary to my further work on Patreon. And I invite you to visit me on my Patreon page where I go into deeper detail and give further insights into all of these subjects. Now, Spiritual Alchemy builds on the Western Hermetic tradition. Among the texts that we find very important are the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. The basis of Christianity is drawn from the garden myth in the Hebrew Bible, where Adam and Eve eat from the so-called forbidden fruit. I mean, without the so-called fall or original sin that the Christians read out of this text, then we don't need Jesus to die an atoning sacrifice on the cross for us. But in Spiritual Alchemy, we don't have an original sin. We see the creation as a blessing. And this video is to explain how it is that we can read the same texts as the Christian church, but come up with a very different solution. Now, one thing that's very important when reading not just the Hebrew Bible, but also the Christian New Testament, is to understand the Jewish tradition and the Jewish language and the way that their theology has developed, because these texts were written in a particular way to be read in a particular way. Now, this is not just important for the Hebrew Bible, where the language itself provides a theological content by the fact that certain words have interplays and nuances where they work together. But this is also very important for the New Testament, because as we know, the New Testament itself, particularly the earliest strands of the New Testament, was written by thinkers who were directly connected, who were steeped in the Jewish tradition. Now, this idea of understanding the text in a Jewish way, with the understanding of the Jewish reading and their theology, is not done in any great depth by the church. Okay? Now, the concept of the fall itself, like the Trinity, doesn't appear directly in the New Testament. It is alluded to by Paul when he talks about the first Adam, which is from the Hebrew Ha-Adam, meaning earthman, and then Jesus being the second Adam. And it wasn't until the 4th century when the theologian Augustine took this passage from Paul and then formalized it into the dogma, the working tenet of Christianity of the fall and the original sin. But it is clear when you read the fuller context of Paul and the works attributed to Paul that Augustine has taken Paul out of context to create this dogma. Now, in Judaism, the words for creation and blessing are beriyah and berakah. Okay? And they are connected. So, in Judaism, they have never had a fall. Now, this is an important point to remember. The Jews wrote the Genesis myth, and they wrote it to be read in a particular way. And we understand the development of Jewish theology because the Midrash and the Mishnah provides us an ongoing commentary which affords us an historical understanding of the development of Jewish theology, and the Jews have never had a fall or an original sin in the way that they read the Genesis myth. Now, the Genesis myth doesn't play such a strong or central part to Jewish theology as it does for Christianity, but in general, the way that the Jews read the Bible and their worldview, with different nuances, of course, but in general, Jews see the world as not being quite perfect, and it is our job to make it more perfect. And that is what our role is here on this earth. Now, the symbol of circumcision comes into play here, where the Jews see that creation isn't quite perfect, and with a little snip, we are helping to make creation more perfect. The mystical exercise of Kabbalism is also based on this idea, this concept that creation is not quite perfect. Now, in Kabbalism, you have what the rabbinical mystics call the tree of life, which is the Kabbalistic frame, where the divine spark comes from heaven through the Sephiroths to earth, and that is an inner program of mystic development that each individual undertakes with the exercise of Kabbalism. And again, by doing this through what can be seen as a double grace, we are helping creation in our own inner world to become more perfect. And the double grace is that the spark, the divine spark, as it comes down, somehow it is split on the way down the tree of life, and by being split somehow it loses some of its energy. And through, as I said, a reciprocal grace, it is our job to bring that spark back through the tree of life, through the Sephiroths, so that it completes the cycle to God, and we are making creation more perfect. In the example of Kabbalism, it is making the individual more perfect in their inner life. Now, to see the event in the garden as bringing a fall is obviously not the only way to read the text. It can also be seen as a metaphor for the development of individual self-awareness or self-consciousness. And as I've said before, in the mystic strands of Judaism, the commentators and the theologians see the universe as becoming. And this is in exactly the same way that biological evolution sees the material universe in the process of evolution and becoming. The mystics in Judaism have also had the same idea, that spiritually, that we are becoming. Each individual is becoming in their life, and we as a culture or as a collective race, we are becoming together, becoming closer to the perfection that was initially ordained for us, rather than that we are somehow under a curse or a fall. And someone that's reading the Hebrew Bible in the original language, particularly when you see the word plays of Beriyah and Berakah and the other understandings which I will explain, in Judaism, you would be very hard pressed to say that we have come under some sort of curse that is from the beginning, that we have inherited, as it is stated in the Christian dogma of the fall. Now, the idea that Adam and Eve's actions in the garden brings, or is a metaphor for bringing conscious self-awareness, is illustrated directly in the text, where immediately after the event, they clothed themselves. Now this is an illustration not only of conscious self-awareness, but this is also an illustration of a concomitant aspect of this, in so much as the paradox of the awareness of the self brings a greater awareness of the other, and clothing themselves, the action of clothing themselves by Adam and Eve shows that they saw in a new way, after eating the fruit, each other as being different. Now this is a compensation. It's filling the gap of the separation that one feels in the further evolved trajectory of conscious self-awareness, where we feel that we stand alone, that we are other. And to fill that gap, we see also another other, and we recognize more deeply the other. So the connection between Adam and Eve is deeper. And this is illustrated once more in the text, where it is only after eating the fruit that Adam names Eve. Okay? Now I know that even in Judaism, this particular aspect has had a patriarchal gloss placed over it, where it is seen that the naming of Adam, that Adam's naming of Eve, the earth mother, is a form of control. But again, this is not the only way to read the text. In both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, the action of naming someone is not so much that you have power over them, but but that you have a greater intimacy. One's name in ancient languages in general, particularly in Greek and Hebrew, one's name is a handle. And to give someone your name means that you are giving them the trust and respect. And this is illustrated in the New Testament with the exorcism episodes, where there is a great importance on placing, on knowing the name of the demon for the exorcist. Again, this could be seen as power over the demon, but when we look deeper into the text, it is the knowing of that person, which is like a psychotherapeutic action in the dynamics of the exorcism process. Now, if we look at the text in Genesis, it is taken by the Christians that after eating the fruit, death came into creation, and suffering also came into creation as a result of that. And I want to elaborate on these points to understand them a little bit better from the mystic perspective, because, as I've stated, in spiritual alchemy, not only do we see that the whole of creation is a blessing, but that everything has a purpose. Now, the strongest argument against the existence of God or a designer or a creator in the universe is the argument from evil. And simply put, if God is all good and all powerful, then evil cannot exist, but evil exists, and therefore God cannot exist. The most powerful argument for the existence of a designer or a creator or God is the design argument, where we see that everything has a purpose, everything is like a large clock, every part plays a role in the functioning of the greater. And all of the answers that have been given to the argument from evil have been trying to say, well, free will or other aspects that are dealing specifically only with man's inhumanity to man. But how do we answer the fact that there are earthquakes, there are floods, there are other natural disasters where suffering is actually endemic? It's part of the integral dynamics of creation. Therefore, suffering must have a purpose. And if we read the text, the Genesis text, a little bit more deeply with the mystic gloss and the advantage of understanding the Hebrew theology behind it, we can actually see what the function of suffering is. Because not only do Adam and Eve, by the eating of the fruit, attain to greater self-awareness, not only do they have a greater awareness of the other, they have a deeper intimacy with each other through the evolution of self-awareness. But that deeper intimacy means that when we are faced with the loss of the other, we will suffer more greatly from that. And then this becomes an evolutionary spiral, because when we are suffering at the loss of our loved ones, we are thrown once more into sharp relief standing alone, and we are once more aware of ourselves as an individual, and we become more self-aware. And so this is an evolutionary spiral. And in fact, it can be argued that the role of suffering in creation has been a major factor and catalyst in the development of individual self-awareness. It's an evolutionary spiral. Now, in the garden myth, the very wise serpent knew exactly what God had said to Adam, and he said to Eve, when he was talking about eating of the fruit, Eve said, we cannot eat of the tree and we cannot touch it, which is an extra addition that she has put in from what the text states that Adam said to her. And she said, for on that day we will surely die. And the serpent said, no, you shall not surely die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will understand good and evil. You will know good and evil, like the gods. Okay? And then after the fruit was eaten, Adam and Eve did not die on that day. Their eyes were open, and they were as of gods, and saw good and evil. Now, in one strain of Christian apologetics, one of the answers to the idea that Adam and Eve did not die on that day is that they didn't physically die, they just spiritually died on that day. However, this is missing the import of the Hebrew words mot to mot, which has been translated as in English die. And the context of this, or the fuller meaning of this word, is not just that you will die a spiritual death. It's hard to translate mot to mot into English, but it would be something like die the death or double die, and it means a spiritual, a physical, and an emotional death. It's unequivocal in that day, and they did not die in that day. Another Christian apologetic is that one day is like 1,000 years to God, so therefore Adam and Eve did not live longer than 1,000 years, and therefore they died on that day, which could be okay, except that before eating the fruit, God had already given the admonishment to Adam and Eve, or to Adam, that to go forth and multiply. So if death was not part of the dynamics at that point for Adam and Eve, we would soon have been faced with a major overpopulation problem. And also the tree of life stood in the garden at that point before eating the fruit. So if Adam and Eve did not know death before eating of the tree of knowledge, why was the tree of life standing in the garden? So of course, all of these aspects create great problems if we want to read the text literally and as a for. But if we look at the text as being a metaphor for conscious development, or the development of conscious self-awareness, then these things are not so problematic. Because in fact we could say that death, and particularly suffering, comes into creation because it enters more fully into the consciousness, the conscious apprehension of Adam and Eve, as they become more self-aware, as they are able to achieve more intimacy with each other. They are then exposed to the greater level of suffering after that event. And of course, if this is a metaphor for evolution, we're not talking about something that happened on one afternoon by someone taking the fruit and then giving it to their partner. This is a metaphor of an ongoing, a long process. Now, not only was the serpent right that their eyes would be opened and they would see as gods, but this whole concept of being as gods is something that is the meaning behind that we are made in the image of God. Now in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, with which all of the New Testament writers were steeped in, okay, and in the New Testament itself, where it is written that we are the image, or that Jesus is the first and the others will follow that image. The word is icon, which means archetype or first form, and this is a very important point in the creation narrative and in the ongoing evolution of the, or development of the text, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament, which in my next video I will go into great detail to explain this idea of being made in the archetype of God, being made in the first form. But for now, I just want to bring our attention back to the serpent. Now, for many people, especially in the West, the serpent has not such a good mythological reputation. The symbolism of the serpent is not always so positive as it is in the East, where the serpent has always been a symbol for wisdom and spiritual growth. Now that it sheds its skin is one of the reasons that the serpent has become a symbol in the East and in many aspects of Western mythology as a symbol for spiritual growth. In both the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament, the serpent is in fact given a venerated place outside of the Christian reading of the garden myth. For example, in Matthew 10:16, when Jesus is sending the disciples out to teach, he says, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents." In Numbers 21:8, Moses makes a fiery serpent as a protection symbol for the people as he is leading them through the desert. Okay, now we can see this same symbol of the trickster in Prometheus, who steals fire for cultural advancement for the people, and this is outplayed in many different cultures. In Polynesian and American Indian mythic cycles, we have this trickster god, okay, who is instrumental in bringing new cultural advances to the people. In the apocryphal book of Enoch, the fallen angels actually teach people how to make fire and to build tools, or to make tools. The idea is, in short, for this video, is that we are co-creators with God. And again, this is illustrated in the text. It is illustrated, for example, when after eating of the fruit, God teaches Adam and Eve how to make clothes. It is more graphically illustrated in the text, where the very curses that God gave to Adam and Eve are illustrative of the co-creator role that we have as people. That Eve, the mother of all, has greater pain in childbirth. What more graphic illustration do we have of our co-creator role with God than by giving birth? And as evolutionary biologists are now saying, the idea that human women have more pain and problems in childbirth is connected to the larger head that we have with the larger brain, and the fact that we now stand upright. The curse given to Adam was to tend the garden and to work. Again, by working, this is being a co-creator with God. And as I said, in my next video, I will go into much greater detail about this concept of being made in the image of God, or that we are as gods. In John 10:34, Jesus says, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods?" And he is quoting Psalms. Okay, and this is a very important aspect or concept to understand, not just the Hebrew Bible, but also the New Testament, because this concept comes into play all the way through. And this can be seen as the archetype of our higher self, if you like. It is also a theological underpinning to the basis of my idea of the archetype for personal development being the central archetype around which all other archetypes are centered. So, I thank you for watching this, and I invite you again to come to my Patreon page. I have put a link in the description part of this video, and you will be able to find much more information on all of the aspects that I am detailing here in these videos. So thank you very much.